I'd like to start our proceedings by welcoming everyone. Thank you for coming to this panel session. I would urge all of you to move a little closer. It's I think, encouraging to speakers to see their audience. We also have put a brochure, a sort of handout on the seats closer to the front that gives you the title and the name and a little bit of biographical information about each of our speakers. So anyone who feels free, please do come up closer. This panel is being hosted by the Catalogue Raisonné Scholars Association, which is an affiliated society of College Art Association. And the theme for today was objects of indeterminate status. That is a description usually, most often sort of used for objects where the attribution is uncertain. The authenticity as a work of a particular artist is in debate. That is not what we are interested in talking about today, but rather the kinds of classifications that define objects and therefore work within Catalogue Raisonnés, which make a promise of having a complete and accurate and empirically based resume of an artist's body of work. What one realizes in getting into Catalogue Raisonné research is how much the accretion of all these thousands and thousands of facts about objects result often in great indeterminacy, both on the simplest level of what a title might be, how do you define what that is, or a date, but more broadly in terms of what kinds of objects would be classified as, let's say, a sculpture versus just an object the artist made. What counts for a work of art, since the Catalogue Raisonné in general is a Catalogue Raisonné of an artist's body of work. And even in a post-Duchampian era where art can be anything the artist defines it to be, most artists are not very clear in defining exactly what their artworks are, and they don't label them neatly. So the things that are left in the studio, for example, you have to determine whether you feel that it is an unfinished work or a fragmentary work, perhaps. Should or should not that be included in the Catalogue Raisonné? And standards over time have changed as the great interest, for example, in Rodin's plasters. There have come to be then Catalogue Raisonnés of the plaster models rather than just the finished works. So these, what I think we would like, and I'm hoping can be a topic of conversation both by our speakers, but also in a question and answer and in our respondent, Chazz Evans, is really, do classifications matter? If they do, why do they matter? And if they do, how do you define things? And is it important to be clear and articulate those definitions? And is that possible? So those are the sort of open-ended topics that I hope we'll engage in. Our first speaker is Jeanette Redensek, who will be speaking on Josef Albers. And if you'll come up.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for putting together such an interesting topic, and I'm happy to be here. So, every painter loves his paints. Josef Albers loved his in very special ways. Beginning in the 1930s, when he emigrated to the United States from Germany and began to paint in earnest, Albers recorded the materials he used to make his paintings on the backs of his works. In this instance, the 1936 painting Monument of General Omega, he's recorded in great detail the recipe followed to prepare the ground for the work. Layers of animal glue, calcium carbonate, formaldehyde, varnish, the paints here described as just pure oil colors. For the rest of his life, Albers kept track of the materials used to make his paintings, the names of the pigments and the names of the manufacturers, the varnishes, whether he was using oil or cassine, whether he overpainted any areas, whether he mixed his paints, which he rarely did. That Albers chose not to mix his paints is an important part of this story. He employed over 300 different paints from more than 50 producers. When he needed a cadmium yellow that was slightly darker, slightly greener, slightly more gray, He didn't mix in black or green or gray. He just sorted through the paints on his workbench until he found one from another manufacturer that fit the purpose. It wasn't that Albers couldn't mix paints, it's that he chose not to. He used paint straight from the tube as a kind of ready-made, the same way he had his color class students snip pages from magazines or later use screen-printed color aid papers. Albers' theory of color was in fact no theory, but rather a method of iterative experiment. Try this combination, try another. You could not predict the outcome until all of a sudden the magic happens, and you can see the interaction of color. The boundaries between color sharpen or soften. Perceptual effects appear. Colors move forward or recede. There's an appearance of column or fluting or the echo of an inner color on the edges of an outer color, or as here in a painting called justifiably dark. How carefully chosen paints could produce the illusion of a filmic overlay, as if one color were atop the other, while in fact all the paints were laid down in a single coat side by side. Color was Albers' life's vocation, culminating in the 26-year-long project of the Homage to the Square, a series of over 2,000 paintings, which can properly be seen as a single iterative experiment in which the finished paintings serve both as trials and as proofs. And he wrote it all out for the world to see on the backs of his paintings. These notes were initially, I believe, aide de memoire for himself, but eventually the color notes on the back of a painting became part of the work and part of the meaning of the work. And even today, collectors fret about value and authenticity if their paintings don't have visible color inscriptions. Sometimes they're hidden beneath the frame. And so we have color notes for about 95% of his works. What this means is that we know exactly which paints Albers used to make each work. We know that he was attentive to differences of like-name paints from different manufacturers. The cerulean blue from Lucien Lefebvre was quite blue. That from Rembrandt, slightly paler, slightly more green. When I began working on the Catalogue Raisonné of Albers, right away I considered the color notes to be an essential part of the record for each painting. The artist tells the researcher what's important. And if the names of the paints were important to Albers, they were going to be important to me, or they would become important to me. And I quickly realized that knowing the names of the paints would enable me to identify and distinguish closely related works. For instance, there are 6 paintings titled Homage to the Square, 2 whites between 2 yellows. And I wasn't initially sure about the dates and dimensions. Truly, it did help to know which 2 whites and which 2 yellows were used to make them. As the catalog proceeded, I came to see that the color inscriptions were like laboratory notebooks, and I began to comprehend Albers' works, especially the Homage to the Square, as a kind of quasi-scientific project. As I learned more about his work, I began to see that Albers' art was as much about paint as it was about color. Enter the color studies. More than 300 different paints, more than 50 different manufacturers. That's very unusual among practitioners of that time, among artists of that time. So how is an artist going to keep track of all those paints? Albers did make true preparatory studies for some paintings and for his prints. These are oil on blotting paper with the colors that he used, sometimes noted along the edges. And sometimes they served as prototypes for print portfolios where one half of the study stayed in the studio and the other half went to Tamarind or Gemini to prepare the inks for the prints. But the studies I want to focus on today are pure paint studies, records of the pigments available to Albers in his studio. He scraped patches of paints from the tubes onto scraps of blotting paper or shirt cardboard or fragments of broken masonite, and he kept these on hand as studio tools. Some of these are indeed studies for specific paintings, as here, recording the colors to be used for an Adobe titled 6 Greens. Others are indices of similarly named colors. Deep cadmium yellows and oranges is here. pale cadmium yellows here, dabbed along the edge of the board, the name of the paint and the manufacturer written alongside, and then the enfilade of paints flashed with a stroke of varnish to show how the colors would darken in the finished work. The inscriptions are often complemented by Roman and Arabic numerals signifying the month and day on which the paints were purchased. He wanted to use the same tubes of paint for each painting because paints can change dramatically between batches, as we'll see. So the Albers Foundation has about 1,000 of these color studies. And I believe there were many, many more that Albers discarded along the way. And while Albers occasionally made gifts of the full preparatory paint sketches, say of the full homages, the pigment samples were kept in the studio, never exhibited or sold during the artist's lifetime, stacked on the shelf, put in cardboard boxes, and like everything else in the studio, kept in warehouses and in the basement and garage of the Albers' very modest ranch home in Orange, Connecticut, from the time of the artist's death until the Albers Foundation moved into its present facility in 2000, which meant that we now had room to store and catalog and archive work. A few of these paint studies were shown in a 1988 Guggenheim Museum retrospective, but the next public presentation didn't take place until the year 2000 at Pace Gallery, when several were shown in a vitrine as part of a solo exhibition. A few more were included in 2008 exhibitions in Sao Paulo, and in a show of Albers and Donald Judd's work at the Josef Albers Museum in Bottrop, Germany. In 2011, they were central to the show Malerei am Papier, Painting on Paper, organized by the Staatliche Graphische Sammlung in Munich. That exhibition traveled to Bottrop, Hummelbeck, Basel, Paris, Lisbon, and New York, and with it traveled the idea that these pigment studies, these studio artifacts, were part of the standard equipage of an Albers exhibition. And I don't think there's been a major or lesser exhibition since that time that has not included a selection of color studies laid out in vitrines or mounted into frames. All of the color studies, the full works as well as the pigment studies, have a feeling of immediacy, the artist's thinking, the artist's mind, the artist's hand, and that is incredibly attractive to curators. The positive side of curatorial interest has been a much better appreciation of Albers' artistic processes, the psychological and technical depth of his work, and the conceptual integrity of his color experiments. The downside, well, we'll get to that. When I started compiling the Albers catalog in 2007, I considered these pigment studies, these color patches, to be archival material, artifacts that inform the catalog, but were not part of the catalog. But that perception changed suddenly and steadily and increasingly, with inflections of immense possibility, but also concerns, for 3 reasons. First, the realization that the works were accumulating exhibition histories and literature citations, that curators and researchers considered them artworks in their own right. Second, the works were acquiring provenance, histories of consignment, gallery sales, new owners. And third, and this is for me the crux of the argument today, we were developing a fuller understanding of the scientific importance of the studies. It's fascinating, of course, to see Albers obsessing over cadmium oranges and cerulean blues and keeping track of the manufacturer's batches and the dates on which he purchased paints. It's fascinating, enriching, inspiring, revelatory to see what Albers saw. But in working with conservation scientists, I came to see that the pigment studies are part of a spectrum of materials that the Albers Foundation holds, including hundreds of tubes of paint, his studio notes, the notes on the backs of paintings, and all of this comprises an amazing and valuable index of 20th century commercial artist pigments, a unique set of holdings. And moreover, these works, study samples can be taken from them. Those pinpricked microscopic fragments that are difficult or impossible to glean from the surfaces of modern paintings particularly, but which can be taken from the wisped edges of thickly impastoed patches, such as we find on these studies. The indices of paints exist also on the paintings themselves, but the paintings are scattered to the four winds all around the world. The Albers Foundation's collection of color studies is still largely intact and held in our storage vault in Bethany, Connecticut. Let me lay out a particular instance that demonstrates the potential scientific value of these pigment studies. Let's talk about gray. Albers had at his disposal from the 1940s through the early 1970s more than 30 different grays, all commercially manufactured and available in tubes. Most of the major manufacturers produced gray series, targeted primarily towards designers and illustrators. The Grumbacher Company produced 2 series. The Riley's Gray group of 9 paints, shown here, a gradient from near black to near white, and the Illustrator's Gray series of 5 middle tones. The Entwistle Company produced the Optical Gray series, 6 tones of warm gray and 6 tones of cool gray. The Shiva Company produced Chapin Neutral Grays in 5 tones, 3 of them shown here alongside 2 Riley's Grays. Now, gray is an interesting color because it's much more than just a mixture of black and white. There are such achromatic grays, but then there are the chromatic grays, the cool and the warm, the bluish and the yellowish. Most of the manufacturers produced chromatic grays. But what makes a gray look bluish? What makes it yellow? What's actually in these paints? And if we knew what was in them, would we know how they would change over time? And Albers himself noted changes in the paints, both in the appearance of the colors on specific paintings, but also from batch to batch. And sometimes these changes from batch to batch are quite dramatic. Most of the paint companies don't exist today, or certainly don't exist in the same guises of 50 and more years ago. They've been bought and sold and consolidated. The old color files and recipe archives have been tossed. And I know because I've tried to find them. It's very rare. For the Albers catalog, for the Albers Foundation, what had begun as a pleasant but pretty predictable task of documentation now has the potential to be much more and to be valuable to many more people than just the Albers Foundation. We have an opportunity to push the conception and functionality of a Catalogue Raisonné in new ways. There's the potential for an expansive and integrated study of the way variable pigment shaped Albers' investigations of color. What was it in those cerulean blues that made them look more green or more blue or lighter? What's the nature of the mineral content? What kind of dyes are being incorporated? What are the binders and fillers, among other variables? So, a study of Albers' grays, paintings, pigment studies, remaining tubes of paint. A study of Albers' reds, one of the pigment groups that has proven especially susceptible to change with the passage of time, startling and profound darkening of reds within a period of 30 years. Likewise, paintings, pigment studies, remaining tubes of paint. The inclusion of spectroscopic and chromatographic signatures of certain pigments, not just as addenda, but explicated in ways that make those findings and their underlying chemistry really sing. Such studies presume ownership of the objects, the ability to study and probe and take readings, whether physical samples or laser analyses. But at the same time that we're beginning to comprehend the scientific potential of these studies, the art world is beginning to appreciate them in other ways. Objects for exhibition, objects for possession. And this forefronts a big difference between an archival artifact and an artwork, especially for artist foundations that rely on sales of selected artworks to sustain their operations, as does the Albers Foundation. An archive presumes perpetuity, and to some degree, entirety. An artwork can be an asset, can be. And the Catalogue Raisonné certifies that status as an art object. The inclusion of the color studies in the Albers catalog will make them available for all kinds of analyses, scientific and artistic. But their inclusion in the catalog also erases the boundary between archival artifact and artwork. And this is the fate that haunts Albers color studies. Thank you.
No, it's okay. Just like I think it's just a little, yeah, that little like thing right there. Yeah. Nope, thank you.
Tracy Ng is our next speaker.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jeanette, for such an interesting and evocative presentation. Tough act to follow, but I will try. So as some of you might know, the estate of David Smith has been working on a Catalogue Raisonné of the artist's sculpture now for many years. As a short plug, I'm pleased to share that we will be going to press over this summer, and the 3-volume publication will be available in spring 2021, barring any further delays. Anyway, we have certainly come across a few objects of indeterminate status over the course of our research for this project, and this presentation will give an overview of our thoughts on how to treat these works. To give you a little bit of background, our current Catalogue Raisonné project builds upon the first Catalogue Raisonné of sculpture compiled by Rosalind Krauss, that's her PhD dissertation, which was published in 1977. In light of this, the estate was fortunate to have an established list of approved sculptures to work with when finalizing its own comprehensive list. Still, there is a significant amount of work not included in Krauss's estimation. A small percentage of these omissions consists of a few previously unknown works that Smith had gifted to friends and neighbors, such as Freeform, shown here. This new-to-us piece was discovered while reviewing an article about a small retrospective at the Hyde Collection in 1965. The text casually mentioned a ceramic work loaned by an Elsa Steinbeck of Bolton Landing, which is where Smith lived and worked. We were able to trace the current owner of the work from this name, and he was kind enough to bring it to the estate office for inspection. So in this case, we had no problem identifying the work, which was signed, dated, and marked with the location of its creation on the verso, which is shown on the left. We also have a comparable work in the estate's collection, which is shown on the right. This, however, is not the norm. For the most part, the collected group of works omitted from Krauss's list were objects of uncertain status and not so easily classified as in or out. So our decision-making process. The estate had actually formed an advisory board specifically for the Catalogue Raisonné project. So we posed the question of how to treat unresolved objects to its members. It was helpful to have an open discussion about this topic, and it felt good to have certain choices validated by our board, such as the decision to omit a group of ceramic plates, one of which is shown here, that were more closely related to painting than sculpture. Although some thought that it would be useful to include these in the sculpture catalog because it demonstrated a bridge between Smith's sculpture and painting, we were mostly in agreement that it was beyond the scope of the current project. Otherwise, everyone voiced a lot of valid questions and concerns, which confirmed that we had to be thoughtful in our treatment of these works, and gave us an idea of what sorts of questions to ask ourselves when going through this process. Still, we were pretty much on our own to come up with a viable course of action. Our research team had already been leaning toward the idea of placing all of these uncertain objects into an appendix in the catalog, but we weren't really sure what to call it or how to organize it. Krauss had actually included a section of miscellaneous objects in our Catalogue Raisonné. Her explanation for grouping these works together was simply that they were too difficult to categorize, which didn't really offer the structured system of judgment that we were looking for. She also assigned them an official Catalogue Raisonné number, which didn't seem appropriate in this case if we were uncertain of an object's status. So a solution materialized for us while studying the format of other Catalogues Raisonné, specifically the Jackson Pollock catalog when we saw the Problems for Study section. Calling this section First Study seemed to be a masterstroke in that it would allow us to avoid deciding one way or the other about the status of uncertain works. Instead, it empowered the reader to do so. It also let us bypass the larger issue of authentication. Later, we learned that the Pollock Foundation had planned a supplement to the original catalog with a section called Works for Further Study, which seemed to be a more neutral title to use without the word problem. So we had an idea that we could all get behind. The next step was to figure out what was going in the appendix. So we chose a committee of 4 people to discuss each item on our list: the estate's executive director, the director of our Catalogue Raisonné project, one of the artist's daughters, and the estate's sculpture conservator. In this way, we were hoping to make a fully informed choice after considering each work from different angles, including, but not limited to, connoisseurship, archival research, personal knowledge of the artist, and structural expertise. Unofficially, this committee also had a 5th member, David Smith. We realized, however, that taking the artist's thoughts on his own sculpture into account would complicate matters more often than clarifying them. Smith's views on his own art were inconsistent, shifting with the evolution of his artistic practice. It would also be difficult to translate some of Smith's historical actions into decisions carried out today by the estate. For example, one extreme example is Smith's insistence on disowning works that were altered without his knowledge or consent. If we decided to try to remain consistent in those cases, we would be forced to leave out several sculptures from our Catalogue Raisonné, which would most likely cause problems with the current owners. So while Smith's thoughts on sculpture are undoubtedly important, we had to be realistic and measured in our interpretation there. So in an effort to streamline the decision-making process, we divided the list of uncertain objects into categories, hoping that it would be easier to come to a consensus when comparing a group of similar works. Most of the questionable Smith works fell into 5 major categories, which we will examine shortly, but they're listed here. 1, objects without visual documentation, so works that we've never seen before, don't have a photograph of, or any sketches by the artist. 2, molds or models without an extant final cast, so works that are known from existing designs in a plaster mold or a wax model, but things that Smith never cast in metal, which is what he normally used for a final form. 3, functional objects, which are things that we would consider more utilitarian than artistic, like a set of spoons or a chair. 4, fragments, objects that were previously part of another sculpture. And 5, unfinished works, as in sculptures that Smith never completed. All right, so category 1, objects without visual documentation. Our first example is a mural allocated to the offices of WNYC, for which we have no visual reference. It was created as part of the federal art project of the Works Progress Administration around 1938, which was before Smith began to photograph his works consistently. The only evidence we have for the existence of this work are letters from Smith's first wife, the artist Dorothy Daner, which is shown right up here. In the letters, Daner is approaching a curator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York with an entreaty to help find this work, and it included a description. In the second paragraph over here, it reads, it was about 3 feet high, possibly 4, very open, vertical, about 2 feet wide and deep, painted in red, yellow, blue, black, practically the whole spectrum, and was made up of many small forms welded together. This mural was never found, so Daner's memories remain the only source. But is this information good enough to use as proof of existence? Smith may have never mentioned the work, but Daner has proven to be a fairly reliable source for events that happened in Smith's early life. And there doesn't seem to be a good reason for her to make up an elaborate story. She wouldn't have profited from it had it been found. However, for the Catalogue Raisonné, a more practical concern for us was how to present a work of art for which we had no solid facts. How do you publish something with no photograph, no title, no medium, no dimensions? Like, how would this even be useful to our audience? Category 2, molds or medals without an extant final cast. This next example is the Polio's War Medal, known visually from a poster exhibited at the 1949 Artist Posters Show. at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which is shown on the left. As you can see, it looks like the poster was made from a photograph of an actual medal, but where is the medal? Again, Smith's first wife, Dorothy Daner, was our main source of information here. In letters, she refers to a 20-inch medal planned in conjunction with this poster. And lo and behold, about 5 years ago, the estate did discover a plaster mold for this work, which was about exactly 20 inches in diameter. We showed it to our conservator, and he found traces of certain substances on the mold, suggesting that it was indeed used for casting. We found an invoice as well from a foundry for casting. Around the right time, it was dated October 1949, but there were no further details on the paperwork. So, taking all this information together, it certainly appears that a medal was created even if we don't have a final product in hand. But should we rely on circumstantial evidence? If so, how much, and what kind of evidence is necessary to merit inclusion? Category 3, functional objects. What we're looking at here is an electrical tower created and installed by Smith on his own property. Smith moved up to Bolton Landing full-time in the spring of 1940, but by that time he had been petitioning the local electric company to bring electricity to the town for almost 2 years. They finally agreed in December of 1940, but the wiring only extended along the main roads. Since Smith's home and studio were situated in the middle of 80 acres of land, he had to build steel pylons like this one to carry the electrical wire to reach the buildings. In this case, the work is extant. They're still up at Bolton Landing, definitely made by the artist, but is this a fine art object? Should that even be a consideration when looking at an artist's body of work? I thought that I had a firm answer to this question until we started looking at objects in the same category, such as these. So on the left is a fireplace set, a set of andirons, tongs, and a poker. And on the right is a headboard that Smith made for a bed frame. So these objects have forms that are more familiar to me, so it was easier to evaluate artistic merit in the designs. But thinking about these objects in relation to the electrical towers made me think again about the way that I was treating all three of them. It just reinforces the benefits of grouping these works together into categories during the process. Category 4, fragments. So this work, the one on the left, is made of stainless steel, and it's related to some of Smith's most well-known sculptures, including the cubis, which are shown on the right. We don't doubt that it was made by Smith because it's featured in photographs taken by the artist. Interestingly, in these photographs, we can see that Smith had once conceived it as the top portion of another sculpture called Sentinel. And I probably should have circled it on the slide, but in the photograph on the left, you can see that the untitled work is sort of upside down and on top of the sculpture in the foreground. In this case, it isn't clear if the artist considered this work a sculpture on its own. He never photographed it as is, which was common practice for Smith after a work was completed to document its final form. It's also much smaller than the other works made in this style and with these materials. The Little Untitled is less than 4 feet high, while Sentinel and other works like it, like the cubis, are 9 feet and upward. While it's mounted on a base, we don't know whether or not this was done by the artist. It's well known that the estate commissioned Smith's former assistant to complete several of his works posthumously. We do know that this object was formerly part of another work. So do fragments count? Like, how do you evaluate whether or not an object is a fully realized standalone artwork? And category 5, unfinished works. As I mentioned previously, Smith had planned several works that were completed by his former assistant, Leon Pratt, including Tower 2, shown here at the left. Even without a familiarity with Smith sculpture, looking at a Pratt work side by side with a Smith work, you might be able to see a difference in the artistic sensibilities of both men. For example, I can see an openness and a gestural quality in Smith's work that the Pratt lacks. And yet, Pratt was operating with Smith's tools. He was using the metal shapes that Smith had set aside for this work. He was putting them together in a spontaneous manner, as Smith often did. Before Smith's death, Pratt was already doing almost all of the welding for him. But how much importance do we give to subjectivity or the artist's hand in an artwork? So in conclusion, you may notice that I didn't comment on any of the final decisions made or answer any of the questions, and this is because the idea of a works for further study section was ultimately discarded for our project. There were some concerns about the authoritative tone of the catalog and how a section like this would clash with that tone. It was also suggested that including such a section would invite questions of authenticity anyway, so the estate abandoned the idea. The approach that we used ended up being fairly straightforward. Either a work was officially in or it was out, which left less room for speculation and uncertainty. This meant that certain questions were given more weight, such as, was this definitely made by the artist? Or, are we sure this ever existed? When questions couldn't be answered definitively, the information just became less important when coming to a final decision about inclusion. Like, no matter how intriguing like these hints or clues could be that we got from bits of information found. Regardless of the end result, I think it was important for us to go through the steps outlined earlier, and I absolutely stand by this decision-making process. Researching these previously disregarded objects allowed us to make connections with other well-known works. Like, for example, going back, the little untitled work on top of the Sentinel, like, you get a better understanding of both of the individual objects, and it opens up Smith's working process. In terms of organization, too, it was also useful to compile all the questions that we had and to standardize certain definitions in an attempt to use similar criteria when considering each work, at least within the different categories. While these examples, I know, were specific to Smith's body of work, I hope that sharing our thoughts about handling objects of uncertain status will make this particular step a bit easier for others working on a similar project. So for those of you who are or are planning one, best of luck, definitely. And thank you for listening.
And our final speaker before our respondent is Robert Hayden.
There we go. There we go. Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Susan, for inviting me to participate on this really fascinating panel. I greatly learned a lot already from the two speakers today. Today I'm speaking about the Los Angeles-based artist John Altoon. He was much loved in the Los Angeles art community of the 1960s. He was a core member of the now legendary Ferris Gallery, where he had 3 solo exhibitions between 1958 and 1963. Irving Blum, the gallery's proprietor, said of Altoon, "If the gallery was closest in spirit to a single person, that person was John Altoon, dearly loved, defiant, romantic, highly ambitious, and slightly mad." Blum's description of Altoon as slightly mad refers to his mental illness. A prominent Los Angeles psychiatrist diagnosed him as schizophrenic in 1963. It also refers to an event that shocked the close-knit community of artists in Los Angeles in the summer of 1964. During a psychotic episode, Altoon went into the gallery's storeroom and slashed some of the 18 large-scale canvases of his acclaimed Ocean Park series. An example is shown here for you on the slide. The paintings are notable for their exuberantly colored biomorphic forms which float within a white field and playfully straddle the line between figuration and abstraction. Whoops. Each of the large-scale paintings is roughly square, about 80 by 80 inches. They are distinct in Altoon's oeuvre and diverge from the bold, painterly marks which fill the entire canvas in his late 1950s and early 1960s abstractions. And here I'm showing you side by side the earlier work with an example of the Ocean Park series. You can see that the color palette is largely unchanged, although the composition is drastically changed. After the Ocean Park series, he changed to a deep-hued ground of forest greens, blood red, deep purple, slate blue, or muddy brown. Because of the stylistic changes between each series, they are easily identifiable. And here you have an example of his series that followed the Ocean Park, known as the Hyperion series. You can see the ground color distinctly different. Only 6 paintings of the Ocean Park series are extant, and there are black and white photographs of 2 more. However, 7 additional paintings are visually characteristic of the series, but atypically small. The alignment of color and form between these smaller works strongly suggests that they are fragments of the paintings Altoon slashed in 1964. This presentation proposes approach to their exhibition, conservation, and restoration, and argues that identifying the fragments by the series name and reconstructing them when possible is crucial to preserving their meaning. At the beginning of 1962, at the age of 36, Altoon moved to a studio in Venice, California. Within 10 months of the move, he produced the series of 18 paintings named after Pacific Ocean Park, a nearby nautical-themed amusement park. The Ferris Gallery first exhibited the series in October of that year. Altoon repeatedly worked in series, and although the Ocean Park series was not the first time Altoon used a series title to identify a group of paintings, it was the first time the name derived from his studio location. This title signified more than a locale. It grouped his paintings and drawings into aesthetic statements rooted in a place, the artist's creative environment. In this way, the series title correlates the artwork and the artist. He further marked the paintings as personal by boldly scrolling his name and the date at the bottom of each canvas, with the same type of gestural marks he used to make the objects in the paintings. And you can see on the lower right his signature and the date. And this was not something, he never signed his paintings on the front in any other series. Most significantly, he developed the images in his paintings through automatism and free association, a technique used in Freudian psychoanalysis that Altoon underwent repeatedly. The process involves the therapist asking hypnotized patients what ideas or associations come to them in the dream state. With the Ocean Park series, Altoon used free association to manifest images of his psyche onto the canvas. Presenting the 7 known fragments as autonomous paintings, as has occurred in recent exhibitions, detracts from a proper evaluation of the artist's oeuvre by misrepresenting a part for the whole. The fragments do not have the energy and cohesion of the complete paintings. Ocean Park series number 6 is a good example of this. The top third of the painting is lost. The missing fragment included, when you can see here superimposed, the fragment on top of a photographic image of the full painting. The top third of the painting is lost. The missing fragment included a phallic form on the verge of touching its tip to a heart-shaped vulva-like object. The lost forms are not narrative elements, but their exclusion breaks the tension in the complete painting and erases the sexual iconography that is prevalent in many of Altoon's pictures. Color harmony is also interrupted in the fragmented paintings. Each form is a different hue. The interrelation of each element relies on a sophisticated coloration. As a result, the painting fragments lack the intended forms and color, such as in the missing piece of Ocean Park number 5. And here again is the fragment superimposed on top of a black and white image that we have of the work. This last canvas is missing a large area of bright purple, a complement to the yellow, which harmonizes with the secondary colors orange and green. So you don't get the full effect of the color harmony with a missing piece. The fragments are incomplete works of art that pose questions about classification and stewardship. Altoon damaged rather than destroying them and kept the pieces, which suggests that he values them. Developing a standard practice of stewardship is problematic because 4 different private and public collections own the pieces. All of the fragments, including the ones held in museum collections and the 2 in private collections, previously belonged to the prominent Los Angeles-based art collectors Ruth and Murray Gribben, who purchased them directly from Altoon's estate. The Gribbens are deceased, and no evidence suggests that they knew the paintings were fragments when they bought them. And until my research in these paintings, the museum to which the Gribbens donated the fragments were unaware of their status. 2 well-known paintings by other artists provide examples for the conservation and exhibition of the Ocean Park fragments I propose. Edward Manet's The Execution of Maximilian, for example, was cut into pieces that were later purchased and reassembled by Edgar Degas. The National Gallery in London purchased them from the artist's estate and combined them on one canvas, approximating the original size and composition of the undamaged painting. Another example, Vittorio Carpaccio's Hunting on the Lagoon, now in the J. Paul Getty Museum collection, is half of a painting that was sawed apart. Its didactic panel includes a statement that, quote, "This sophisticated waterscape is the upper portion of a larger panel that was cut into 2 parts long ago," close quote. The Getty also includes a photographic reconstruction of the painting with a red dashed line indicating the position of the division, which you see there on the right. And the lower section is also held by a museum too. The 2 pieces thus can really not be joined back up together since 2 different institutions own them. By making the public aware of its fragmented status and providing an image of the whole painting, the Getty offers information transparency and an example of excellent stewardship of fragmented works of art, in my opinion. Ocean Park Series number 5 and Ocean Park Series number 6 could benefit from a similar plan. Identifying and exhibiting the paintings as fragments and providing photographic reconstructions would improve the accuracy and transparency of information to the art viewing public and facilitate potential future identification of the missing pieces should they come onto the market or if they're in current, held by private collectors. When multiple fragments of a single canvas exist, such as the 3 pieces in the Laguna Art Museum collection, the Manet provides an example of effective conservation. By unframing and placing the fragments on a single canvas, the painted portions that wrap around the sides of the stretchers would be visible, allowing viewers access to an approximation of the original. Viewing the 3 paintings together outside their frames would provide a cohesive visual presentation that is not possible when framed separately. So here's a potential example of what it would look like if they were placed onto a larger canvas approximating its size and the positioning of the 3 fragments. There's a missing fourth piece at the top right. Regrettably, because Altoon destroyed some of his best canvases, only 6 of the 18 Ocean Park Series paintings remain as a testament to the artistic achievement of the series. In a handwritten note regarding Altoon's legacy, the artist Billy Al Bangston wrote, quote, "He was his work, and his work was him," close quote. Identifying the existing fragments and missing pieces is crucial to understanding the meaning of the artworks and their significance as a series. Without those fragments, Altoon's self-portraits of the mind become more blurry than his dreamlike and colorful, free-floating images. Thank you.
And our final speaker is Chazz Evans, who is playing the role today of respondent. He is also an artist and a teacher and a curator who's very involved with new media and has a perspective on these older media and the questions that are relevant for both new and old. So please welcome him to the front.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you so much for these really interesting presentations. Right, I have been asked if I could respond with a new media specialist's perspective on the issues related to the Catalogue Raisonné. And I was excited to receive this invitation, and also what is kind of a challenge, as the conservation of 3 studio artists may not appear to concern computation and art at first glance, which is my specialty. However, the questions raised in these 3 presentations closely parallel 2 ongoing discourses in new media art. The first dealing with media archaeology, and the second related to data collection. And I will try to briefly address both in this response. First, we have the question of the status of Albers' color studies, brimming with historical value, but formerly categorized as ephemera rather than art object. Second, a collection of fragmentary objects related to the career of David Smith, all hinting to the relevant stories of his life and work, yet unable to be squared with the logics driving a catalog publication. And third, certain entries in John Altoon's Ocean Park series, once whole, now fragments in need of reconstitution, but with obstacles in the way of that goal. When taken up by historians of technology and new media art, this question of how a primary object relates to its ephemeral antecedents, the answers vary. My particular practice focuses on the emerging world of video game art. So in the presentation of video games, MoMA curator, design curator Paola Antonelli frames the importance of bringing underlying source code into the permanent collection of MoMA, and that's the way they have decided to preserve games. It's live software running in the moment of play that is foregrounded as the primary object. But conversely, in other proposals like in Game After, a cultural study of the video game afterlife, Rayford Gines suggests that the paraphernalia, such as box art, trade magazines, pamphlets, and so forth, are at least as important, if not actually more important, than what are considered the primary objects themselves. This is perhaps more the perspective of the historian than the art historian, but its practicality speaks volumes. Computational systems that run code break very easily, and caring for the durable materials that speak to what objects gives us more chances of understanding the material culture of the past. So if we take this media archaeological perspective that values fragments very much and apply it to the questions of our 3 artists in today's panel, it certainly bolsters the importance of all of these indeterminate objects described. An artist's intention and the historian's ability to synthesize knowledge from objects are really different goals, and all of these indeterminate objects can very easily provide a lot of historical value in different contexts. It's very clear that could happen, even if they don't necessarily square with these structures of preservation that they exist just outside of, marginally. So outside of the consideration of ephemera and its importance, scholars of new media are concerned with process. Part of this is certainly the process of what happens when software is run, but also the process of how that software was made before code is compiled and results are proffered. So if a catalog can be considered a database, and its raisonné can be considered the process of data collection and data entry, the work of technologists speak directly to the questions in these presentations and point to how consequential these processes can be. The problems inherent in deciding what goes into a catalog and what does not parallel the problems data scientists and software engineers have in deciding what does and what doesn't go into what appears to be a disembodied and authoritative algorithm. Of course, algorithms are just information and instructions written by people, and those people are actually responsible for those algorithms. I'll editorialize briefly. Once packaged, they both take on a black box nature that no longer point to the individual thoughts, feelings, expertise, omissions of knowledge, and biases of the people working on those projects. And in both cases, this deferral of responsibility has consequences after the product is used as public knowledge. To cite a striking but clear example in the world of technology, Safiya Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, articulates the deeply racist values that shape Google's search results with particular respect to searches about women of color. Her critique of Google's search tool handily dismisses the presumption of neutrality often granted to databases, database querying, and those who create such systems. Instead, her critique reminds us that all databases and data collection include bias, and when that bias is left unacknowledged and uninvestigated, it can have significant consequences. Naturally, the context and subject of Noble's project is different than the Catalogue Raisonné of our three artists, but I find this still a strong theoretical framework for keeping a sharp, self-reflexive attitude when deciding what goes in or out of a system. Just when you get that kind of question, it can be a red flag. It's like, well, something big might happen because of any of these minute decisions. So this shouldn't be taken as a condemnation of all those who select data, but instead suggest a method of data curation that is not overly proprietary, has a level of transparency, and also shows forward compatibility. Data curation simply is subject to a number of human contingencies. This is not really a solvable problem, but it can be improved by the acknowledgement of this fact and then working that fact into the process. And as a side note, I don't know if any of you are already thinking this, but what I'm suggesting here is not the same as populist crowdsourcing, opening up lines of transparency towards how archives or catalogs are made. It's completely different from making decisions based off of public polls or online voting or that sort of thing. That's not what I'm talking about. So these two themes taken together has made me, in my own practice as a new media curator, highly self-reflexive about the decisions that go into writing wall labels, especially when it comes to materials lists. With the lack of any kind of consortium of how standards for how to list the myriad of materials that might go into the computational artwork, and honestly, a justifiable reluctance to establish any standard like that, it is incumbent on the new media curator and archivist to be aware of the fact that writing a materials list in a wall label or building a catalog is one of individual creativity and contingency. It is a rhetoric that you, the writer, are responsible for. Therefore, you make sure that you have a rationale, and you make sure that that rationale is ready to be offered alongside the project somehow. When the historian, collector, or other interested party decides to check in with the structure around the collection you have created, they can engage with that rationale for yet more historical context and can then work with those logics how they see fit in their own vantage point of history. And the kind of thing I'm talking about that has to happen for new media art exhibitions, I think sounds a lot like the sort of reconstruction of paintings that you were talking about in the Getty and from the Manet and so forth. Making sure it's just transparently just right there for the story is fully there for the general audience to enjoy. So this is an attitude that closely parallels publishing open source code with comment lines and API documentation. That's some jargon that I can throw out there as related, but entirely encapsulated in the world of tech jargon. So anyway, I hope that taking this brief walk into the domain of tech preservation and data collection sheds light on the questions brought up in these presentations. And maybe these themes point to answers, but perhaps more productively may offer more questions that I share with both the panelists and our audience present. And this practice could be categorized as creative problem creation in the place of creative problem solving. And this is a practice championed by some new media practitioners like John Satrom. So for Albers' color studies, here's some questions. For Albers' color studies, if their historic value is clear, but are problematized by, say, their monetization, could their contents be reproduced and published electronically, sidestepping the problems of provenance in the market? For the Smith fragments, what will be their ultimate fate? And why, in the end, were they all dismissed from the catalog in unison? Is there a life for the objects of further study outside of this catalog that is perhaps online? Likewise, is there a context where electronic reassembly of the Altoon Ocean series fragments, again, possibly online, contributes to their holistic appreciation if the ideal goal of bringing their physical components back together is perhaps proven impossible? I welcome any ideas towards the answer to these questions or more questions provoked by this set from our panelists and our audience here today. So I guess it's here we invite everyone to come up.
We'd like to have the panelists come up first, and
So yeah, first we're just going to talk amongst ourselves for a moment before kicking it wide open. I don't know if that was interesting to talk about. If official documentation, official publications like say catalogs don't square as a method for the preservation of these indeterminate objects, are there other opportunities in electronic media? Like, say, websites that once more study is found for the objects for the study, it's okay, you just update the website, right? Or a wiki or something like this.
Yeah, well, I mean, you do know that a lot of catalogues raisonnés, aside from being in print, they are published online. There are, artifacts, and Panopticon provides you with platforms to do so. We had talked about that in other sessions of like the Catalogue Raisonné Scholars Association, and I think that people are sometimes intimidated by that because of, the costs of and the labor of having to update it all the time. Because like websites, I think people have it in their minds that they live forever.
They do not. They're also very labor intensive.
Yes, no, they are. So like the money and then the work gets, too much. But certainly there are probably forums online for that. Like I love being able to look at an object online in a photograph because like you can zoom in on it forever. In a way you can't do that in person. Like they won't let you get face up to a sculpture anymore. Not even if you work for the estate of David Smith.
I'll continue with that a little bit. Online is not a solution to all of these problems, but it offers other problems, but also opportunities that get to something that really struck me about what you said, and it's something that I'm dealing with myself as we move towards publication, is I tend to want to kick the fence a lot, and I find the genre of the Catalogue Raisonné and the published Catalogue Raisonné to be important and monumental and of immense use to me over my life as a scholar, but also incredibly confining and limiting, and not just about, mostly what we've talked about today is not the centrality of like the major works of an artist, but these things that are kind of on the margins, but in exploring their problematizing them, you do get to certain fundamental things about the artist that is fascinating. And I think that's something that all this has in common. Each of these three presentations has had in common. But where online does become interesting, and it fascinates me for Josef Albers, is that you get to explode the book and explode sequentiality. And I say that as someone who is really committed to publishing those 9 volumes and really loves books. But the character of Albers' work, where you've got 2,000 paintings that are really, really similar in composition, identical, for more or less. And we have one volume that's like 1961, 1962, and as I said to our director, there are 500 paintings that are going to be in that volume, and I want you to know that over half of them are all yellow. And so what do you do with that? And I'm not going to push that farther, but I just wanted to present it as it's not a panacea, but there are opportunities there.
Certainly for the Autun fragments, digital reconstruction could work in the sense if you were publishing them in a Catalogue Raisonné. But my paper has more to do with the actual experience of seeing the work in an exhibition or in person. So what you miss with digital reconstructions, especially with the 3 fragments all owned by one museum that would need to be put together to kind of give a partial, full reconstruction, is you miss the scale. You miss, I'm always amazed when I see a digital image of an artwork and then go to a museum and see it in person, and like that's the painting I've known all these years. You're shocked. It's like, so the scale and the tactile nature of the physical object is so different than digital. So while it can provide some good things, there's a lot missing from that too.
Surely, yeah, it's a way of sort of explaining different kinds of contexts, but ultimately has no real proposal towards some sort of authentic that, of course, the most loaded term in art history, authentic reconstruction of the original thing, but but also leads to other opportunities. I don't mean this the least bit sort of disrespectfully, but when I see your reconstruction of the fragments in the presentation, I sort of say, oh wow, like this could really become a video game where it's like, we can make your own Altoon reconstruction and move them around, Of course, it wouldn't be pointing towards any sort of origin of the thing, but perhaps productive of ever new context for thinking about the work.
John might like that, actually. He might have fun with that. He's, like they said, he's slightly mad.
Right. Were there any other sort of like addenda, sort of, especially when it comes to the sort of cliffhanger you leave us on, Tracy, what the ultimate fate of the Smith fragments are? I mean, is talking about them here the end of their life? Like,
I mean, I hope not. We actually had a researcher come to the office. He wasn't exactly interested in these objects of uncertain status, but he was interested in things that hadn't been exhibited before, like clippings that Smith had used to inspire his work. So like ephemera, things that you wouldn't normally consider as objects of artistic value. But he was so interested in them that he decided to petition a gallery to have an exhibition about these works. So they were shown, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity for that. I think that all of these objects have some sort of value, if not necessarily what we would consider in value for the Catalogue Raisonné.
One other thing you said, Chazz, which I thought was interesting, was creating the parallel between Catalogues Raisonné and program code, which is like the black box of judgment making. And from my perspective, I was intrigued to hear Tracy talk about committees and things like that, because we don't. The Albers Foundation is a little bit unusual, and we have a group, but it's quite much more informal. And so, how decisions are reached are intuitive and immediate and not documented. There is a place, as one knows, anyone who's open to Catalogue Raisonné, usually at the opening chapters will give a methodology for why decisions were made and what's included and what's not included. But your comment made me think about there are judgments with every object that could easily be exploded and displayed for each artist, having to do with methods and processes and materials and things like that. And it's fascinating, but then I thought, stop talking that way because you'll never finish this Catalogue Raisonné. Yeah, and it goes to that, both like what the orthodoxies and the strictures of a Catalogue Raisonné and what the Catalogue Raisonné is for and who it's for. And so that is like the conservative notion of the volumes and the books and the authoritative exhibition histories and provenance. And that's a beautiful thing. But explicating these other things is, maybe that's someone else's work.
Right.
Yeah. It's a second generation, but it also does suggest, depending on the artist, some fundamental changes in the form of a catalog itself.
So if having a completist attitude towards, self-reflexively working in the story of all the judgments that went into making such a publication is it's just untenable.
It would be incredible, though.
It would be incredible. Is there some way to at least gesture towards it, or like open up, like if this is the sort of thing you are interested in, reader of this book, like this is how you can get into it, even though it's not all here.
Come talk to us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's ways to formalize that sort of as a part of the attitude of the publication, the tone of it.
And I think oftentimes the title of the Catalogue Raisonné itself gives you an idea of what is included and what is not. For example, when you say Catalogue Raisonné of the paintings, or something like that, and then that specifically leaves out all of the other methods that the artist may have worked in. And yet, like for Albers, now these color studies have become so common in exhibitions that they may not be included in the Catalogue Raisonné ultimately, or they may, but people know about them because of their inclusion in exhibitions.
They'll be included,
Yeah.
yeah. And they'll be included, and we're actually designing online features that allow people to search the paintings by color and to correlate paintings by color. And that's quite interesting, and I don't know where that's all going to go, but it's how I understand Albers' paintings. When you do a Catalogue Raisonné, you find yourself rising in the air, and pretty soon you're able to you look over the landscape of what that artist has produced in a way that may not even have been available to the artist himself or herself. And that is a position that requires a lot of thought because it's a position of responsibility. And if Albers used the same color combination in 52 paintings over 26 years, I mean, he's changing out the brands and everything, but clearly he's interested in that. I know that, and I want the world to know that. And so that can only be done really in online features. I mean, it's hard to imagine it in a book.
Such an enormous burden of responsibility. You take that to and realize, oh, I'm the one to determine this, right? To make the determination.
Yeah. Or the committee.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we are the ones, right?
Yeah.
So now's probably a good time to open it up.
Kick it down.
If there's any other questions from
So I would like to open this conversation up to the audience, and you can direct your question to an individual or to everyone, including our respondent, and we'll simply continue for the next few minutes before the next session kicks us out. Thank you. So anyone? Be bold. Have a question.
Well, Susan, do you have any questions?
I'm going after the woman in the back. She got me first.
I have a question about the painting. Forgive me if I missed this, you said it was possible as well. Did he himself restructure them after the zone vandalism of them?
That's not entirely clear. The paintings the fragments in his estate were sold after his death, and every single fragment that I know of that I've discovered is in the exact same type of strip frame, but every single fragment was also at one point owned by the same collector. So it's very possible that the collector had an affinity for that type of frame and that they framed them and had them stretched in that way. And now that those collectors are no longer with us, we don't know. So it's at this point, I don't really have a good answer to that. I don't believe he stretched them. I think most likely that happened at the point of sale when the estate was trying to offer them through the market. Thank you for that question.
I have another question about Altoon and about when you approached the museums that did have these fragments and showed them, look what you have, what was their response?
Initially, huge disappointment, because if you are a museum that thinks you have a autonomous Altoon Ocean Park series, that's really a wonderful thing. So to find out that it's not that and it's just a fragment of one, there's a bit of disappointment that comes with that. So, yeah.
And I would think, I mean, the Getty has a tradition of scholarship and of presenting and making transparent often their scholarship within the gallery, but many museums don't have that. And I think for them it would be almost like an ontological crisis to have to deal with that.
Sure.
Yeah.
one could hope that it's like, oh, a mystery is afoot, and they
Yeah.
get excited about it.
Yeah.
Oh, but I can imagine the discussions in the meetings and the registrar and the conservator and the curator and the person who provided the funding to acquire that painting. Ay, ay, ay.
What I was wondering would happen when I started this research project was if that it would end up that two different institutions owned fragments to one painting.
Yeah.
Then you would have a real issue. That did not happen. These are being uncovered, over time. They come up on the market every once in a while at auctions. So I'm hoping that additional ones will come out, which is why I want the information to get out. Mm-hmm. So when they come, you can say, oh, that piece belongs to this painting, and hopefully possibly reconstruct them. So,
But is that information being hidden, you think? Like, people don't want that to be known because, it somehow devalues the work?
I don't think so. I think nobody, the myth of Altoon in this destructive act is really quite, if you study at all kind of the LA art scene of the mid-century, that's like everybody knows this great story about Altoon destroying his paintings, but nobody really took the time to figure out which paintings did he destroy. So nobody knew. They just kept repeating the story without knowing what specifically what they were referencing, and so nobody really knew that the ocean parks were just fragments were a result of that action.
I see. So you're breaking it open.
Yeah.
Chazz, I have a question for you. You talked about the kinds of unconscious biases that can be hidden in what is often regarded as sort of impersonal code, neutral code. And as an artist and as an educator or curator, how do you safeguard against that kind of bias of which you are unaware? How do you make yourself are there questions you ask, or do you present it to other people and get them to critique, or, to sort of help you talk about what you might not be aware of, or?
Right, I mean, I guess I tried to mention there's no real solution to it, right? We, of course, are completely bound to our own subjectivities and perspectives, there's a software metaphor here, which is the difference between closed source and open source software, and it's just really more about, not about do you have biases when you make something, but sort of like what is the attitude towards presentation and publication, right? It's like, is it this completely resolved and then hidden, and like, don't worry about what went into that. It's good. We finished it, right? Like, that can be an attitude, and that's the way, like Adobe and Microsoft products are brought to our attention when they're riddled with errors, in fact, or you can have the kind of software project that is stitched together by a community. It's full of errors, but everyone sort of knows that, and so it becomes like, to use an old adage, a feature and not a bug. So, I mean, if you're playing open hand like that, right, and you have sort of structures in place to be edited and to be critiqued and versioned without it being a matter of like personal disgrace, like you have nothing to fear, right? It's just transparency in short, right? So, and I think, those kinds of practices, I mean, it's interesting, I think, to use like tech practices as an illustration of that, but it's happening through any kind of historiography, right? Anytime that we're trying to, teachers of any kind of history, you try to put in these markers to students, learning, like, and also this person resolved it this way and this person resolved it that way, and just so you know, once you start working on this, you can resolve it your own way too. Just sort of keeping it that to be that kind of attitude of sort of like active scholarly questioning. I think that is the same value shown in any sort of scholarly context as it would be in creating software.
And for the others of you, the issue of authenticity, attribution issues are almost never explicitly addressed. The statement that it's in a catalog is sufficient, so the reasons the methodology by which that decision was arrived at is left completely opaque. Leaving that aside, on these issues of how we classify, is something an object or a sculpture object? Is it, how do we define a painting? The color studies versus what is the difference between, do you think that will be explicated in some way or addressed, if not to define what you left out, but at least to define what is in for each of you in studies of your respective artists?
Yes. Yes, and my mind is going so fast on other things that you said that the explication, and this goes to like the methodology of the Catalogue Raisonné and wanting to do a really, really good job of it, of saying how things got in. And for Albers, the issues of authenticity are huge. We don't have a forgeries problem, but we have forgeries. And for the foundation itself, and certainly the foundation leadership, one of the great hopes is that the Catalogue Raisonné will solve this. I happen to think it'll create another set of problems for enterprising forgers, but yeah. But yeah, I don't know what to say about that, except that I reflect on it. Like, let me say this, that there will be a scientific chapter, and it will include things like extreme high resolution imaging of the surfaces of the paintings, which for an artist like Albers is extremely important. And it's, for me, I do authenticate, and it's all about how was that paint put down and who put it down, because this is a man who had masterful hands, who used a palette knife, and very, very few painters can paint as well as Josef Albers, although there are forgers who have tried, and it's really at the level of magnification and extreme high resolution with raking light that you can actually see the technique, and that will be explicated as to what constitutes authenticity and what doesn't. And there are no questionable works in our catalog. There is no gray area of was it made by Albers or was it not made by Albers.
But will you also address this issue of the sort of migration of the color studies from a category of archival artifact of process into, and do you give them the status of the artwork within the
I'm trying to sort that out, and in writing this paper and being able to present a paper as part of this panel, it was very timely for me, and it was intended as a polemic, not least to convince the foundation itself of the importance of these works, and to have like a well-developed argument to present to the director to say, no more consignments, I would hope. I mean, I understand the desire of people to own them, and that will become more permeable, but I feel this kind of possessiveness, which is natural in making a Catalogue Raisonné, and I'm trying to mediate that while at the same time being professionally responsible and scientifically responsible. And so I would like to see the scientific work done before we begin to release many more of those. And so I hope I can write that story and make it an interesting story, and not like, well, they used to just be archives, and I would like to be able to convey some of the drama and the historical drama of that within those essays. Let's hope.
Any other questions? Rachel?
I'm hoping you can address unfinished works a little bit more. I've seen them included in some CRs, not included, and as we all know and has been mentioned, they can provide such invaluable insight into the artist's thinking, and so should they be included, and how do you present that? Where does the artist's intention stop mattering so much, and does that factor into organizing the information?
I'm actually interested in hearing what both of you might have to say about that. I mean, I think I did outline it in my presentation, but, we didn't really come to a firm conclusion on that. And with all of these unfinished works that we had, yes, you can standardize a set of questions as much as you can, but only some of those questions are going to be answers, or are going to be answered. So if you have answers to questions like 2, 5, and 10, and then the next one, only answers question 1, it's just really hard to compare there. So I don't have, a great answer to that, and sometimes you do. You have to, use your best judgment with that, and just, make sure that everybody else on your committee is on board.
We've got about between 50 and 60 unfinished works that were left in the studio. And so right now I say, oh no, we're not going to include those. It's study material. This is my attitude. But as Tracy was talking, I thought, could they migrate? Because of there's interesting things about them as artifacts, and in showing Albers predicting what color he's going to use and what's going to happen. And so for me, that's really important. I'm not going to tell anyone about it.
I mean, to the question of unfinished, a great deal of Cézanne's, what's considered Cézanne's oeuvre catalogue, would be works that were in his lifetime or at the time of his death seen as unfinished and probably not, appropriate for exhibition or sale. So the question of finish, I think, like all these classifications, are time-bound and will be reconsidered and revised by subsequent generations of experts and also the broad general public. And maybe that's part of that process of keeping an artist's work alive, that we continue to reconsider what it means, what it literally is, and how it should be presented and understood by the public. Is there no other questions? Then I'll thank you again very much for having attended, and on to the next thing.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, that was really interesting. I really love that too.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, yeah.